About a month ago, at a conference out in San Francisco called Social Capital Markets Conference, which if you ever get the chance you should go to, because it's in San Francisco. Really interesting conference where about 1,900 people who are investing in social change are talking to each other. A guy named Steve Wright, who works for the Grameen Foundation, gave a speech that truly was transformative for me. One of the things he said in that speech was that we, as social innovators, are a disruptive innovation. Those of you that are old enough to remember the early days of technology industry, when Hewlett and Packard were still literally in a garage and Michael Dell was still in a dorm room, and when Jobs and Wozniak were still talking to each other, they saw themselves as creators of a disruptive innovation. That they were changing the world through technology. And Steve Wright's point was that we, in this work, are an even bigger disruptive innovation, and that we need to start acting like that disruptive innovation. We need to start claiming that as part of who we are and what we do. We're at the beginnings of this much, much bigger disruptive innovation that is toward an economy that is more just and more sustainable, and an economy that can serve as a solution to the problems of society rather than a cause. And it truly was transformative. And I'm about to introduce you to one of the most disruptive innovators I know. This woman is a problem. That's what I love about her. You've got her bio in your book, so I won't read that to you. But I will tell you that in addition to a professional portfolio that exhausts me, she and her partner are parents of 6 children, which any of you parents out there will attest to is a full-time job in and of itself. My friend, Melissa Bradely.
As I was driving here, I had written down all this stuff to say, and then I was like, well, I hope it's relevant. And as I arrived and started to drive through, I realized what a vast difference. I don't know if people know good old DC, but I happen to live in Bethesda, Maryland, which is not DC. It's like the Truman Show of DC. My partner and I are the only people of color that live in our neighborhood. My partner is a biracial Jew from Brookline, Massachusetts, and we have kids that are the color of that piece of paper to the color of this stand. We are the diversity of Bethesda. Therefore, we're just disruptive because we actually dare to live there. I say that because as I was driving and being in DC, the talk of DC for the past 16 days has been the government shutdown and $17 trillion deficit. And I say with the utmost respect that I drove into Baltimore, who really cares about $17 trillion? Right? Because what $100,000 or $1 million could do to shift those homes that are empty to people on the street is what we should be talking about. Right. And so I appreciate the reality check that I have been in a bubble for the past 16 days around millions, when the reality is that innovation can be incremental and binary and is actually happening right here. And so I agree with the person who said we actually need some more mainstream media, because this is what it's really about. And so I'm going to toss out what I was going to say and just talk about some of the things that I've learned. I'm 45 years old. I have been in the sector, or the social sector, I guess, for almost 20 years, which for a minute there I was like, I'm old. But then I realized my mom is 85, so hopefully I have a long way to go. And also because I have 6-year-old twin girls, so I really don't have much choice. But I say that because time flies. And I'm proud of what has been accomplished, but I recognize there's so much more. My mom is 85 years old, and she can talk about the Great Depression, just over 100 years that we haven't been slaves. And so when we talk about the pace of change and innovation, I, of all people, am always in a hurry. I'm a Capricorn. I got dressed up for y'all, I just want you to know. This is I'm not really big on hierarchy and order, and I'm always in a hurry. But as I've gotten older, I realize that innovation is not about being fast, but it's about being efficient. That scale is not about being bigger, but it's about being better. And so I just want to say that, you know, as particularly again coming out of this bubble for 16 days, there's a few things that I think I have learned, both in my public and private sector life, that I hope are useful. I don't have all the answers. We've had a lot of success in what we've done. I'm proud that I also was a Soros Fellow for a minute, and found that to be exhilarating and exhausting at the same time. But I will say that I think what you all are doing, and I spend time looking at the workshops, is where the real work is. And I would argue where the real money needs to be. What I do now on a day-to-day basis, besides being a parent and hopefully not being called to the principal's office, is I run a company called New Capitalist. And I do that because I was born in 1968 to a single-parent mom who lived in a one-bedroom household. I went to school back, I guess whatever the precursor was to, I guess it was Pathmark, because I'm from Jersey. And I would wear shoes from Pathmark and a uniform to a Catholic school. I was made fun of every single day. Every single day. I didn't have the hottest hairstyle, none of that. But the one thing my mom always said to me is, you can be anything that you want to be. And she never blamed anybody. And those were two very important things to me, because it's really easy to blame people right now in terms of where we are. I could blame myself, I could blame other people, but the reality is that the one thing that I did take away that I can only imagine you all are instilling every day is that we actually do have the power to make a difference. The challenge that I find as having lived in San Francisco, I have to say, I like the seasons personally. The whole like corduroy shorts and the Birkenstocks and fleece, it just didn't move me. At some point in time I want like some sandals. But the reality is that too often we think everything has to be huge and big and takes lots of money to solve the problem, and it really doesn't. The biggest impact my mom had on my life is that I remember one day she came home with this calendar, and it was a calendar of all the presidents that had come through. You know, so this is like, you know, the 70s, so clearly there were no women on the calendar, and Barack had not made it yet. And I looked at the calendar and I said, so who are all these white guys? And she said, these are the presidents of the United States. So where are the people of color? Where are the women? She goes, they're coming. And she said, and they can be you. And I grew up with that inspiration and aspiration that it could be me. And I'm proud to say that, I guess last year I had a chance to at 85, now she's like feeling herself. So she's got this little bucket list of all the things she wants to do. So she tells my sister and I, like we got that kind of access. You know, I want to go do this. I want to meet Barack. I'm going, yes, so does everybody else in America. But I had the chance to get her in. And she pushed her way through, and thank God nobody knocked the 85-year-old woman over. And she went up to the front, and I couldn't really tell what she was saying, but she came back, she had tears in her eyes. I said, what did you say? She said, I told him I've been waiting for him all my life. And I said, what did he say? He said, thank you for waiting. And the patience that the 85-year-old woman had, I realized that's the patience that I need to get, right? Because this is not about a race. But this is about being there for the long haul. Because if it's only been 100 years or plus since we've been out of slavery, it's probably, in all realism, going to take another 100 years to get us to where we really need to be, right? So what does that mean for us as leaders and innovators? One, it means to take care of ourselves. And I have to say that's a lesson that I just learned, to take care of ourselves. And I say that because there's been this whole refocus on kind of talent acquisition and human capital. And oftentimes that's been, let's go get the best and the brightest. Let's go get all these Ivy League folks who also apply for the Soros Fellow and drop out the sky of Harvard and come into our community, and then they leave. And we just think, oh, it's talent acquisition of people who are not here. And they're going to come bring us something and then go on to the next place because they're scaling their organization. But the reality is those that are here that we actually need to develop. And so I'm extremely impressed. I did research on some of the groups that are here, of making that investment, of really understanding what it takes to invest in people and not just processes. To recognize that the cult of personality is over and is now for a pragmatic perspective in terms of how do we really grow leaders in our community. One of the things that when I graduated from Georgetown, I ended up starting an organization. And one of the reasons I started was that Georgetown, being a Jesuit institution, caring about other people, had a huge volunteer public service division. And I remember walking across the quad, and I was a finance major. I was like, you know, poverty is not cute. I am tired of standing in line with food stamps and looking around and making sure none of my classmates are watching me. I want to make as much money as possible. And I remember walking across the quad, there was this community fair, and I was like, I ain't got time for this, I'm going to my job, I got 3 jobs, I got work study, I need to get to class, I need to pay my bill. And this young lady says, hey, what are you doing for your community? And I go, I know you're not talking to me. I'm going to class, I'm here, I showed up, I'm one of 100 black people in the class, I'm doing my job. And she said, that's not enough. And I said, what else do you want me to do? I got 3 jobs, I was a bartender, I worked at the intramural program, I worked in the law library, I was a law clerk. We used to instead of taking a taxi to deliver files, we would run down to Pennsylvania Avenue and hope that we got before the SC filing so we could pay for our food the next day. I was like, I'm doing all I need to do, sister, what you want? And she said, I need you to volunteer. And I said, with what and where? And so she had me volunteer, and I showed up, and I didn't get it at first. And I showed up to get on this little short blue bus to go out into DC. And I said, what on earth am I walking into? And what I walked into was the After School Kids program. And it was a program that worked with kids who either had been incarcerated or their parents were incarcerated. And I noticed 3 significant things. 1, I was the only person of color in that room. 2, I was the only woman in that room. And 3, I was the only person that even barely understood what the heck was going on in their lives. Yeah. And let me be clear, that does not mean that you need to be a certain person or a certain type to work with folks, but you need to recognize that the circle of influence and power needs to be reflective of the diversity that is within each person. That it is, again, not the crypto personality, but it is indeed who they can see as role models. And we have many. People got mad when Charles Barkley said, I'm not a role model, but I appreciated that, right? Because it should not just be that so far away of which we dream to be, but that which we can achieve right in front of us. And I recognized then that it was extremely important that we shift the nature of service to this Jesus Christ superstar, I'm going to save you, to I'm going to break down the walls, create the pathway for you to find your own power. And that's a huge shift that I know many of you probably already know, but let me just say, most people in DC, they don't get that. And folks in California, they don't get that either, right? Because most folks are focused on the inefficiency of the markets around, I'm going to give you money to get bigger. I'm not going to necessarily give you money to get better. And that's a big deal. So the one lesson I would say is we have got to begin to invest in people and not just processes. And all that I offer today, I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying mainstream media cares. I'm not saying it's going to make an iTunes podcast and 1 million downloads. But I'm saying that if we live it and we talk about it and we share it and we transfer it, it actually could happen and it actually could scale. The second thing I would say, as a finance person, I'd be remiss to say, everybody else is making money off of us. Can we make money off of ourselves, please? Right. Please. And I don't think that's a bad thing. So I will be the first to say I am a capitalist with a conscience. Ain't nothing wrong with that. Okay, I don't think that's a bad thing. Particularly based on where it came from. It's a normal trajectory. I'm not going out and, I'm not going to be Jay-Z, but I certainly don't think it's a bad thing that I want to have better. Because that's what the American dream is supposed to be. And right now we're telling people, well, you really can't access that, so you get like 1/1/8 of it. But that's not true. The reality is that there is the potential and possibility that the pie could actually get bigger if we let people contribute to it. But when we lock you out the system, it can't get bigger. So what I would say is, as we think about innovation, and let me just reinforce that, as someone who, for better or for worse on most days, sits on lots of boards, and people talk about innovation all the time in the corporate boardroom, the one thing that frustrates me is that we have now come to think of innovation as just around technology and around speed. But the reality is innovation is not external, it's internal. It's inside an organization, it's inside a person. It's not about a process, it's about people. Because you can show me something, like my 6-year-olds have iPads and they're constantly teaching grandma how to swipe and download and create a folder. But the reality is it's not because they can do this and this and this and they get it. It's because they've taken the time to understand and their brains are open to that. It is not about 2 + 5 to the binary of X or whatever. It's about how am I going to be patient with you to teach you to do something different. And so you have all these policy wonks and, dare I say, all these consultants who want to come help you innovate. But the reality is that it already exists. And so as we do that, then let's be willing to push the boundaries, not just incrementally, and not just from a programmatic perspective, but from a profitability perspective. So I'm going to challenge you to figure out how do you make money doing what you're doing? Because there is a way to still make money, to do well and to do good, and to actually have a positive bottom line. I'm going to give you 2 examples, and then I'll tell you why I think this is really important. One, during my Soros Fellow, I started an organization called Reentry Strategy Institute, and I will give the full disclosure that I did not finish my fellowship. I finished the Soros part, and then I went to another fellowship organization, and we didn't really see eye to eye on what scale was. My project was to figure out market-based solutions so that when people actually left prison, they didn't go back. And so we looked at the root causes of recidivism. We looked at what was happening in a community, and back then Eric had come up with $1 million blocks and how we were spending $1 million supposedly on prevention, but it was really being spent on how do we lock more people up, right? It was back in the day, right before Van Jones did his books to bars work. And then before the school to prison pipeline became something on MSNBC. It was back in the day. And we didn't see eye to eye because my thing was, if I can get into the top 10 markets for incarceration, and we all know where they are, right? The lovely South, pick a state. Lovely California, New York City, and then your typical urban area. So we did North Carolina, we did Arkansas, we did New York, we did the state of California, we did the state of Texas. And that's where we started. And my thing was, I don't need to be in every single state. I don't need to be a $15 million organization to solve the problem. I need to be in key places to create that tipping point and have it expand, not on my dime, but on their dime. I need to get a DA like Kamala Harris to fly around and talk about what's happening in California and why it's working. Needless to say, what that taught me was, I cannot continue to run an organization that is totally at the whim of a funder.
Yes. Right.
I cannot continue to run an organization that lives on 3-year life cycles of funding when people live a whole lot longer than that. Despite the statistics that brothers don't live till 19, we certainly live beyond 3 years.
Right.
And so as somebody who was a finance person, well, this is just not going to work. And so we decided to figure out how can we make strategic investments that actually return an investment and solve problems. So in the state of North Carolina, we realized, and we can all name on every single piece of paper up there, all the reasons for recidivism. But one of the top reasons for recidivism was because people were missing their appointments. Now, why were they missing their appointments? I'm sure somebody gave them a smartphone. I'm sure they had some kind of phone for somebody to call them. But the system set them up for failure. We found that 75% of the folks that we work with, they were missing their appointments because somebody was also smart in the administration, kind of like Florida, would let people just walk out the prison, to say, look, you need to be at your caseworkers at 1 o'clock. And that's on this side of town. I know you can get around because then your mental health is over there and within 30 minutes. That just says the last time somebody actually got their butt on a bus, because there's not a single bus in any community that runs every 15 minutes to get you all the way across town. So we said, well, who's the idiot that can't schedule? So we basically went out and put in $150,000 to create a software system that linked up to the existing system to make sure that nobody had a duplicate appointment. And we tracked that for 6 months. And we said, we're going to put in 150 grand. Let's see how much we save you in locking people back up or trying to find them within 6 months. And if we make money, you pay us back. They were like, yeah, sure, no problem. Of course, they didn't know what the heck we were doing. They didn't understand how it worked. They were like, well, we don't get what's an API? What are you doing? I said, I don't need anybody's personal information. I just need a unique ID. I don't even need to know if it's Raheem or Rahul or Reginald. I don't care who it is. Within 6 months, we had reduced the recidivism by 38%. We had saved the Department of Corrections over $1 million. That was not some new iPhone in a gold color, right? That was not some Twitter 140 characters, how much less can I talk to my parents? That was just a simplistic, common sense idea that saved over $1 million. That was the reality check for me, that innovation does not have to be grand, but it does have to be thoughtful. That it does not have to be pie in the sky, but it has to be relevant to the communities that we serve. I also say that because it shifted our power base and the seat at the table. That when you stop asking people for money, they stop looking at you in a very different way. That when you're able to come and make that financial contribution, things change. The power dynamics shift. And the organization that I started prior to that, we did youth economic development, mostly in public housing and also kids coming out of the juvenile system. And we ended up taking young women, in particular who had kids, off of welfare. This is stuff that we've been doing for a long time, because the reality was, as soon as I could demonstrate that I was financially viable and sustainable, they had no choice but to deal with me. If they think that you're expendable in 3 years, they'll tolerate you for 3 years. But if you're making a financial investment in that same community and having positive results, now you are a stakeholder. And that's where we need to make that shift of not just being a recipient, but a stakeholder and a shareholder in the future of our communities. And I've been there. I've been that recipient. I've been shipped off to the Y. I've been shipped off to different places. But the power dynamic can shift, because that's where the sustainability really comes into play. And I say that because when I think about what Jim said about SoCash, I spent a significant portion of my life as a venture capitalist. And one of the realities that's happening is that people are struggling with, why are we not making change? And so, if we don't make change, let's rename it. let's rethink it, let's innovate, right? So we had the Peace Corps, then that became AmeriCorps, and probably become something. We just love rebranding. And so now we have this big thing around impact investing, right? Let's go invest in the social good. And how do we get a return on that, a financial return and a social return? And we can all, I mean, I personally play in that space, but I have a lot of criticisms of that space. But the one thing that has come out of that is the reality is there is not enough money to solve all the social ills that we have. And so regardless of how passionate we are, we have to wake up and recognize that now people are dealing with opportunity costs and not lives. That they're looking at investment saying, what's the opportunity cost of me investing over here versus investing over here, as opposed to saying it's all worthy. And the opportunity uniqueness around making investments is that you now have the private sector that's paying attention because they recognize selfishly, if people don't have any money, they can't buy my products. If they can't buy my products, I don't make any money either. I'm not going down with the ship. Forget, oh, the tide lifts all boats. I'm not going down. And so the reality is there's a tremendous opportunity of the private sector that I see on a daily basis. Now, let me be honest, sometimes it's philanthropic. Sometimes there's a market angle. At the end of the day, green is green, money spends. I don't really care what your intention is. For me, the ends justify the means. And so there's an opportunity to really think through what your business model is. Is there an opportunity for you to earn some revenue? What we give away to people, can we sell it to somebody else? People in Bethesda buy anything. Because we just want to be. I learned really early on that when we would go into Boys and Girls Clubs and we would go into prison facilities and teach young people about economic development and managing money and starting businesses, and once they started starting businesses for real, right, that we were actually causing tax complications for their parents, all of a sudden all the private school kids wanted to know. So I said, hey, I can democratize this. I'm going to charge you in the private school $10,000 a session because that's going to underwrite my ability to help those that really need it who aren't getting it, and they should be in the public schools they have, where we're spending more than $10,000 per student. So 40% of the revenue that we had at Teddy was totally earned, which again shifted my ability to say what I'm going to do. It gave me a political voice because it didn't really matter. You couldn't tell me you weren't going to give me money because I had my own. And that's significant. And so I'm not going to say that I'm caught up in the hype of everything in the nonprofit sector should be business, but I am caught up in the hype that we do have to figure out how to be sustainable. And if we, those who are the authentic leaders in our community, have the chance to shift the paradigm and generate money, not on the backs of our folks, but for our folks, then we should do that. Because most of the time when I show up, I go, here come the capitalist. Here come the money person. She has sold her soul. Maybe. But at the end of the day, I maybe have sold my soul to help thousands of other people. At Teddy, we moved 12,363 people off of welfare. I'll sell my soul for that. I ain't got no issue with that. We helped teenage mothers in Arlington, Virginia create a publishing company that reduced the gang violence because they were multicultural, bicultural, and multiracial books that broke down the language barrier because so-and-so thought they were calling them one thing and they really weren't, and they didn't understand. Those young ladies got off of welfare, they ended up graduating, they had more kids if they so chose, and they could take care of them. If that's what I sold myself for, then I'm okay with that as well. But the reality is that too often we live in a community or communities that are marginalized and they say that's their problem. But now, coming out of this bubble, that $17 trillion is our collective problem. And so I have two more things that I would say. One is that oftentimes when I come to meet with folks, I don't see what I see right now. I get people who are doing the academic work, I get people who are doing the homeless work. The reality is poverty is a complicated issue. Social injustice is a complicated issue. You name an ism, there's not a single cause. And Lord knows there's not a single effect. And so the one thing that I would say that it took me a long time to learn is that we have got to get together. That I'm sure there's somebody sitting next to somebody or in the front and the back, and you know darn well right now you're competing for a grant from the same place. Because there's only like 5 foundations in Baltimore. And Casey ain't really paying attention. And y'all got more than DC because we only got 3. They all went to Virginia. But the reality is that we got to move past that, right? Because poverty is not going to be solved because I'll take my kid. It's not going to be solved because Mackenzie went to some cooking program and learned about food insecurity. That's not going to solve her issue. It's not going to be solved because she actually showed up for 90% of the days in class. It's not going to be solved because she learned about life skills or she learned a different language or she learned STEM it's not going to be solved because she went to a bunch of sporadic programs. It's only going to be solved if there's an ecosystem. And it's one of the reasons why I was actually very excited to be here, because this is not the norm. right? Fiscal sponsorship, collaboration, people who work it, that's not the norm. Usually it's dog eat dog, compete, compete. So you're already halfway ahead. But the reality is that we're not going to solve these big social problems that all these innovators are so excited about if we do not have a multidisciplinary approach. If we are not willing to break down the silos and say, look, I don't know jack about recidivism, but I know it's important to my community. I may not know anything about food insecurity, but I know I got to address that issue because those 16 days kids were going to school hungry and they weren't paying attention. And that's huge. But we have to own the fact that sometimes we create that competition ourselves. We have got to move our egos out the way to be able to move everybody else forward. The final thing that I would say is we do have to be accountable. And that's not just like, I showed up, I looked the part, I'm there, but we really do have to show results. The one thing that I learned early on, because I didn't know jack about metrics, I was a finance person, I knew how to put together some sheets, I knew how much every dollar was where it was gonna go, and how much it was gonna cost me. But what I didn't know was how to track my success. And thank goodness this guy named Sterling came along and helped me. But at the beginning, I was like most of us, I'm sure, at some point in time in my life, but not now, where I was like, I'm here to help the people. So let me just help the people do my thing. Don't ask me no questions, I'm doing the right thing. But the reality is, that wasn't enough. Right, for me to keep telling the anecdotal stories of Antoine, who no longer hung out and got high, but now he was going to school, that wasn't what cut it anymore. Right? I needed to be able to say that Antoine was on a successful trajectory to get a job and be living on his own and not getting arrested. I needed to be able to show real metrics of success. And I know that oftentimes we say, well, what do you do and how do you know you're successful? We get defensive because you're there from 9 to 9 and they're not. You're giving up time with your kids and they're not. But it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we are not just telling stories, but we're giving accurate statistics. Not because we have to defend ourselves, but because that's how change really happens. Slowly, but it happens. And I have run into so many people, and I have been that person who I'm like, don't ask me what percentage of my kids can now read. They can read. I told you the story. It's in my proposal. But we owe more than that. Saving one is wonderful, but saving one is not innovative for the greater good. That's for the personal good. Saving 100 may be for a community organization good. Saving 1,000 may be for the city good. But there is too much at stake for us not to be thinking about how do we save millions, because that's the greater good. You can't save millions on a story. You can't save millions on one great tearjerker, not even on a documentary. It has got to be cumulative. We have got to be able to say that these 3 interventions led to this percentage of success. Even if it's less than 50%, it's progress. So we owe it to ourselves to be honest and accountable, and we owe it to ourselves to be authentic in reporting that. Don't get caught up, everything has to be 100%, because I wasn't as proud when I was only saying, we got 100 people off of welfare. I can be proud now because we can say 12,000, but 100 was something. It was on its way somewhere. We owe it to the folks that we serve to make sure that we are tracking what works, but more importantly, what doesn't work. And the challenge we have in this work is that we take it personal because it's all we got. And it's our passion. It's, people say blood, sweat, and tears. I'm like, that's an understatement, blood, sweat, and tears. It is so much more than that. But we have got to move beyond the realm of beyond personal and say, what are we really doing for the community? And so I challenge everybody in this room, and certainly challenge Fusion, to say, how do you elevate the success that is happening? How do you own the 1%, the 2%, the 5% change that you've made in somebody's life, and then really spend time together, how do I get to 10%? How do I get to 15%? Because it's gonna take time. But then also own what am I not doing well, and let it go. Just let it go. If it's not working, don't do it. Transfer it to somebody else and give it up. We tend to think that we can do it all, but we can't. I got 6 kids and I barely make it out the door on time on any given day. We all need help. When people talk about it takes a village, I used to be like, oh God, if I hear that saying one more time. But the reality is it takes like a village, and then it takes the next village, and the next village, and then the 5 villages down the street. And so what I would say to you is somebody who literally, as I said, spends every single day with mostly national organizations who think they get it, but they don't. Who are trying innovative things, but are oftentimes missing the boat. And I laugh because I teach at Georgetown as well, and We had a professor who said, well, I haven't been available for these meetings because I'm in the midst of this huge M&A in the not-for-profit sector. It's like, okay, whatever. And so he's on the board of an organization called RARE, which is a $23 million organization, over 400 people. And they're merging with the Nature Conservancy, which is a $1 billion organization. And I said, well, that's wonderful. And what sparked that little journey for you? And he said, well, we realized that at RARE, $23 million, we weren't as efficient as we could be. And I said, it took you out of $23 million to figure out you weren't that efficient? The reality is that if we keep waiting for everybody in DC or everybody somewhere else to do for us, we're going to be in trouble. And I stand here, not as somebody who's been a venture capitalist and living in Bethesda with 6 kids, but I stand here as somebody who probably is and was who you guys are serving. A single parent kid, statistic in every form or fashion, hated to go to school, got in fights, was embarrassed about being on food stamps, and didn't believe that it was possible. And it wasn't because of a program, but it was because of the people who are committed to me and people who are like me in being successful. And I will say, as a parent, the greatest optimism I have, but the greatest heartbreak I have, is that the world is shifting and more people are going to look like me. And unless we give people that look like me and others of different hues and colors the power to change their own lives, we will be no better than South Africa. Right. We will be no better in any other country that says they look out for their own. The new majority, some people call it the opportunity, some people call it the Representative Gutierrez said, is the demographic typhoon, because it's scaring people. It's scaring people that all of a sudden they will have to share. And so I could talk to you about your business model, I could tell you how to raise venture capital, I could tell you how to get some money from a foundation. But the only thing that I could ask, and actually more importantly, thank you for, is thank you for being who you are. Because no matter where I live or where we may move to, I don't sleep at night like every other parent, whether you're in Bethesda or Baltimore, because the world is scary. There is so much at stake. The opportunity costs are huge. And so the only thing I can say to you is thank you. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for the reality check that you gave me after these past 16 days. Thank you for continuing to be authentic. Thank you for upholding the people that you work for, the respect that I've seen in your literature, that I've heard you say this evening. It brings me probably the greatest joy that I could possibly have. I know that I may not, particularly based on my lifestyle, I ain't gonna make it to 85 like my mom. But I know it's important that for the next 100 years, we continue to innovate. We recognize that we may not see it, and that's okay, and we let that selfishness go. And we recognize that people die for us that have never met us, and we have to do the same. That we recognize that we have to be willing to do things differently and take those risks. And most importantly, we have to be willing to fail, not for others, but for ourselves. Because if we don't, the new majority will mean jack, and this will continue. The one thing that my mom always said to me, still says to me, I should say, thank God, is that which we do not know is the greatest opportunity for success. And the reality is the smart aleck kid that I am, we never don't want to know what's going on. We always want to know what's happening. But the greatest fear that America is experiencing is that which they can see. And that is the world is changing. The greatest power that we have is we know what will come if we keep doing our work. So thank you very much.
Talk to the sister.
You said that which we do not know is the greatest,
Will bring us the greatest success.
will bring the greatest success? Great line.
And partly because then you can't fear it. If you fear it, then your whole world changes. And you see that on the Hill. I mean, I hate to be political, but that's what that was about. Right? This wasn't about Obama, this was about a black man as president. Exactly. And it was just straight up fear. It's sad because you know who finally said that on TV? Robert Redford. On Showbiz Tonight. He was talking about some movie he's in where he has 3 lines called All Is Lost on a Boat. And finally the woman said, you know, last time I interviewed you, President Obama had just won a 2nd term. He said, how are you feeling about the country right now? And he was like, oh, I didn't expect a political question. And he said, well, the problem is we're not talking about the elephant in the room. And she said, what do you mean by that? And she was a sister, and he said, this is not about healthcare. This is the fact that the president is black. And she was like, what? And I was like, see, leave it to Robert Redford to bring some reality.
Questions?
I don't know, something that stuck with me was I felt like you kept weaving this theme of like really needing those role models that like look like you and other people having that. And I don't know, that's what's sticking out in my head, that like where do you feel like work can be done there? And that was among many other things. One of the things I'd love to hear more about, kind of your thoughts about role models that are doing finance and being that conscious capitalist for the people who we work with and for.
People sometimes, particularly in light of this mass media, we have created, everything's about a visual. And so people oftentimes, some are limited by what they can see. If we do not give them the choices of what they can be, then we have failed them. And it doesn't always have to be about race or class or sexual orientation or age, but it sure as hell helps. It makes it more real, right? I mean, I have a godson who is now doing his second turn in college. He got caught up in sports. I was like, dude, you're not gonna make it. I mean, I hate to tell you, but it's just not real. And part of that was our fault, right? Because it was like, we went to Georgetown, we took him to games, he got to meet people. I was like, but that's not your life. A, you're not that good. And B, it's just not, the odds are against you. And so what I would say is, I think people think it's so hard. People think they have to be famous. But here's some role models that I would call right here. I mean, I'm gonna call y'all for sure. And so I think it's the role models in terms of a pathway and steps as opposed to the end goal. And that we cannot be naive that as somebody who went to Catholic school while my mom cleaned houses on the weekends, most of the people that I saw were all white. Mostly nuns too. And that wasn't helpful to me. Partly because, not that I didn't trust them, but for my ability to get to trust them took a long time. And there were some missed opportunities there, and I could have gone any kind of way. At the time I wasn't gay, but I probably could have had a good conversation with them at that time. And so, just like in our house, right? We're mostly people of color in our house. But we bring all kinds of people in. So it's not about this purity around it has to be, but too often the options aren't there. And the options that are there that look like us are the Jay-Z's of the world. And while that's wonderful, let's be clear, after reading the Vanity Fair one, all of us ain't gonna be able to create a $20,000 watch. It's just not gonna happen. And when we do that, then we set up this false sense of, I have to get there, and then people say by any means necessary, and hence we have people sitting in prison. Not because they're bad people, because we have put out there, this is what success is, so why shouldn't I have it? I'm entitled like everybody else. So I think it's just being practical around, could be the preacher, could be the nurse, could be the domestic worker. It doesn't really matter, but it's giving people those options.
How you see sort of nudging that paradigm shift forward and how you see interacting with like the mainstream media.
So as much as I hate Twitter, I think what it represents is pretty significant, right? So that all this crowdsourcing, blah, 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 the reality is that if done well and done in an organized fashion, it could actually overtake mainstream media, right? So when things have popped off in Egypt and other places, it wasn't CNN that got it, right? It was Twitter that got it. So I think I still hold mainstream media accountable, particularly because they're dying, that indeed this is their chance to be innovative and actually go local and put out stories that people actually care about and can resonate with, and hopefully they'll catch on. I think radio is catching on sooner than television and some of the others, partly because of their ownership structures, but partly because they get it, right? And the experience of listening versus seeing is very different. I think in terms of moving from people versus process, now at least we have the means, right? So there's Twitter. I'm on Facebook just so I can watch my kids, so maybe that's helpful, I don't know. But I think that there is this opportunity, right? So I would argue that, and is anybody from the press here? Before I
That's okay.
So I would argue that if we had created a hashtag, that said innovation for the greater good, right? And everybody in here tweeted at least 20 times during the course of the day from 10 o'clock, you probably would have had more views than a local multiple newspaper number. And you would have had that en masse, right? Because then you would have started to trend. So to me, it's not, we happen to have the systems in place that actually could say, this room could create a trend on Twitter. We literally could, because it's all about hacking the system and pushing it. If we all spent the next 5 minutes doing that, we would be trending all over the DC area. So what I would say is that these people have the opportunity to tip the scales around what becomes trendy in the news, and I don't think we're doing that. Because I think that we've said, that requires some specialist to come in from MIT and sit there and become my social media intern, as opposed to figuring out how do we just make this stuff work.
Thank you. There's a party. Yeah. Is it there?
Yes.
And what's your Twitter tag?
At Bradely ML.
What is it?
At Bradely ML.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure, actually I'll give you a card.
Great.